Welcome to the Information Security Forum podcast. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert, and this podcast is the final installment of our 3-episode series featuring ISF Managing Director Steve Durbin's conversation with Scott Amyx, managing partner at Scott Amyx Ventures and author of the forthcoming book, The Human Race: How Humans Can Survive in the Robotic Age. Our first conversation with Scott covered his ideas about the future of the Internet of Things, and our second discussion focused on artificial intelligence and what it might mean for the global economy. Today, we'll be talking about healthy social media use and tech use for kids.
Now, you've told me that you're on a social media diet. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, partially, and I have to be very truthful there, is that because of the personal branding that I have been very intentional about the last several years, is that I have been on just about every social media platforms. And I think even before coming onto this podcast, I would say over the course of the several months, I have been paring it down. So at this point, I only have Twitter and LinkedIn. And really the only reason that I'm on it is because my first book, Strive, came out about a week and a half ago. So I was forced to do that. But Facebook and everything I've effectively jettisoned. And it's nice because I can tell you that prior to that, I would easily be spending an hour to several hours a day just maintaining it. Even with tools and teams, supporting teams, it is incredibly manual and time consuming. Yeah. And just being very honest, I appreciate the listeners. I want to be able to interact with you, but I also have a real life to live, and I want to build real relationships as well.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think so often, if you just walk around any city in the world, you go into any restaurant in the world, you will see people having dinner with each other, but they're not present because there is this ubiquitous smartphone that they're all looking at, and that is the other person at the table, if you like. And inevitably, that is getting in the way of this human interaction. And so it's interesting that you've made a conscious decision to actually cut down on some of these things. What has been the impact?
Well, I'm very intentional about what I do with social media. So I think for me, the impact is a little bit less significant in the sense that it doesn't really affect me as much. But certainly I see that with my children who are teenagers. And I think one of the things that we're very mindful is we need to make sure that their center of their worth is firm and they know where that source of energy comes from, and it doesn't come from validation from external parties. And the problem with social media is that it creates a sort of an artificial benchmark. And when kids or adults feel like they can't quite hit that, they, of course, there's plenty of studies that talk about depression and various other forms of malice that comes out as a result of social media. And I think it creates a artificial construct and a persona that really is not necessarily, who you really are in real life. I mean, if you look at Instagram, everything looks supposed to be candid and random, but in fact, it is highly curated and it's almost like professional photograph with objects and certain dimensions and angles. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So let me just stop there.
Do you feel that you make different decisions as a parent than your children's peers? Are you, because you have such an affinity for technology, are you asking for more limits on their technology use than their classmates? Or how do you make parenting decisions with your children around tech?
Well, I think there's my answer and there's my wife's answer. And I think if you were to ask my wife, she would say that perhaps maybe I am a little bit too trusting of our children. When we got our older daughter a smartphone, about a year ago or so, I was under the impression that she was mature enough to handle it. But I think I didn't put enough boundaries or parameters. And certainly I think her behavior was starting to become very much convergent to kind of the average behavior of teenagers. So learning to put some controls and so forth is very important. One of the interesting things is at home, because I'm such a technologist, and this actually is pretty common, including people in security, is that at home I'm actually fairly low tech. I mean, sure, I use a smartphone and laptop, but I try to eschew too many smart things that I'm not too comfortable with. I don't want to bring in more vulnerability than I need to. And because of the global role that I play and the interaction that I have with different sovereignties and governments, I have to be very careful in making sure that my information and my dialogues are not misused in any character, which is another thing that AI is a potential issue for. I recently was interviewed, and I'm going to be contributing to the Environmental Defense Fund. But prior to that, there was another article that I contributed to around a study that came from Oxford, a number of other research institutions around the misuse of AI that gets into machine ethics. And in particularly, not only is AI is actually helping to supercharge hackers and bad agents to actually conduct widespread, scalable attacks cheaply and efficiently and in a more automated fashion, as well as the area where AI gets into military, so smart military, and that is a big concern. So, for example, Korea have one of the researchers or research institutions have created an entity that's going to specifically look at and develop AI military tech, as an example. And that's a big concern. And so that has raised a lot of red flags among AI researchers. But the point of that Oxford study, which is fairly in-depth, is that AI researchers, wherever they may be, they are not developing with the intent of doing something bad with it, but they need to be mindful when they're developing and advancing those capabilities. They need to think in the context of, if this gets in the hands of someone else, what could they potentially do with that? And that is really challenging because in R&D, it is very much encouraged to share your white papers and even have some sample code in GitHub, as an example. So when I met with the team that was involved in some of the Texas Hold'em poker challenge and some of these AI, is that they were very careful not to give too much information because they were afraid that somebody could replicate this thing and basically, become a multi-billionaire playing poker online, as an example. That's just one minor example. So really, with any technology, there is going to be that double side that we need to be mindful of, and we need to be informed again, active.
I sort of derailed your question with my dismayed reaction about how vulnerable we all are. But I wonder, your question to Scott was about the catch-up of a generation. It's going to take some time. And so I wonder if you see an inherent understanding in your children about the ethics of technology, or if you are having to intentionally initiate conversations around technology and ethics. I'm sort of trying to make an analogy of a 2-year-old who picks up an iPad and just knows how to use it, which is astonishing to their grandparents. Are your children or our younger generations expressing concern or interest in discussion about the ethics of technology?
Well, I think it depends on the age segments that we're talking about. I think as you get into high school and certainly college and millennial age, I think there is definitely a greater degree of awareness. However, I think there needs to be explicit dialogue and information and education that needs to take place. So, for example, a lot of the young people are consuming a lot of video, for instance. And as AI gets involved and they start to render fake videos where at some point even we humans that are forensic experts can't even decipher whether that's really a particular politician or a leader speaking and saying those things, or if in fact it's AI artificially created, it's going to be very problematic. So they're creating and consuming and distributing content that they may not know the authenticity of, which gets into a bigger problem of what's happening with Facebook, Cambridge Analytics, and just media in general. And that becomes a real problem. And I've was interviewed by the Pew Research Center around free speech and, how likely are we going to be able to actually protect free speech and inherent kind of the robustness and the integrity that we have to maintain in that. It's questionable. It really is. And I think giving kind of, quick answers of blockchain this, blockchain that isn't necessarily really fundamentally looking at some of the deeper problems, in my opinion. But coming back to your question, it really is, I don't think that depending on the age segment and their level of sophistication, the topics that they're familiar with, they're going to naturally just intuitively know. I think it has to be a very explicit conversation.
Scott, thank you very much indeed for sharing some of those insights. Very, very interesting to hear, certainly about some of the advances that you're involved with in AI and IoT and others, but also perhaps some of the implications and some of the opportunities that perhaps we hadn't thought about. So thank you very much indeed for spending the time. And certainly I found it very, very interesting talking through those different topics, and I hope our listeners did too.
I'm looking forward to the book that's about empathy I think that's the needed component in this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
That was the last of our 3-part conversation with Scott Amyx. Over the course of the last 3 episodes, Scott discussed the future of the Internet of Things, AI and the role of humans in the future economy, and healthy social media habits for kids and for the rest of us. If you missed an episode, just check our website, where this and other conversations with ISF Managing Director Steve Durbin can be found. All this and more at securityforum.org.